Hello and welcome to Inside Events, an international podcast focused on contemporary issues in events and festival. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Brianna Wyatt from Brookes University, and we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling in the context of events. Welcome, Brianna. If you could tell us a little bit about who you are, the organization that you work for, and why you particularly interested in storytelling.
Yeah. So hello, and thank you for having me, asking me to join. My name's Brianna Wyatt. I'm a senior lecturer, and I'm also the postgraduate subject coordinator for hospitality, tourism, and events students at Brookes University. In terms of events, I have taught events, delivering and planning events for undergraduate and postgraduate students, but now I'm leading modules on dark tourism and the global visitor economy for postgraduate programs, both of which those modules we do explore events and festivals within those contexts. So because there's lots of events and festivals that are dark and that occur within the global visitor economy. So but my background actually in research and work experience has been in and around storytelling, which links to this topic, in creating audience and visitor experiences, whether that be in events or visitor attractions in museums, and even in my teaching. So in linking that to what we're going to talk about today, my interest in storytelling is that essentially everyone's got a story to tell, whether that is a small and simple story or a very complex and large story. Everyone has a story, and hearing those stories gives a little glimpse into people's lives and experiences. And so storytelling is, of course, an ancient practice. And we have material evidence that dates back to the Paleolithic period of cave drawings and figurines, and we know that many cultures have and still rely on oral storytelling to pass down generation their histories and their traditions. And I love history and I love heritage and learning about old stories and how things were passed down. And so I guess for me, storytelling is more than just the narrative. It's more than just the information. It's the whole experience of hearing the story and telling the story, how it's told, in what form, because stories can be told in various different forms, not just oral storytelling. What it means to the storyteller, as well as the listener, or perhaps the viewer who's looking at the story, if it's in tangible form. And in terms of events and also tourism experiences, visitor attractions, museums, and how we teach students, it's really important to remember storytelling and how those stories are being told, and that making sure those stories are being told honestly and fully. So I think for me, the interest in storytelling is more about the experience and the whole dynamic of the story in its delivery.
That's great. Thanks, Brianna. That was a great intro. And in terms of the kind of concept of storytelling, if you imagine you're a first year student, you're kind of doing stuff around risk management and, events 101, and storytelling is in some of that. But it's something that you do maybe a little bit later, and it's more advanced in terms of kind of getting their head around kind of the more advanced ideas around storytelling. For a first-year student looking at this, how would you describe or deconstruct the idea of storytelling to a first year?
Yeah, so storytelling, I mean, in simple terms, it's the practice of telling stories. We all tell stories. It's a cultural practice, it's a social practice. We experience it and see it every day when we talk to other people. We use storytelling in education, in religion, in other public-facing functions. It's used in every form of customer-facing services and practices. But in terms of what we're talking about today, events, but also tourism, If you think about going to events and festivals, even visitor attractions and museums, you see it in the experience, you see it in the marketing and the advertising and the political campaigning, even depending on what kind of events you're going to. It's also in the basis of film and television and literature and online gaming. And so it's in everything that we experience, especially if they're customer facing experiences. If you look at even historical reenactments and live action role playing, those are forms of events often seen in festival experiences, and those are underpinned with stories and historical nuances that you can retell, reinterpret, recreate. And so, in terms of events and festivals, I would say that it's important to, as an event organizer, to get a message or a mission or a set of principles or values that you're wanting your audience to get on board with, because you are designing an event to attract people. And within that, to attract those people, you need to have some kind of theme, some kind of storyline, and then with getting the aesthetics, the physical aesthetics, and all of that comes into play within the overall message, which is the story. So, for example, most open air music festivals, right, they're fundamentally rooted in the ideas that underpinned a lot of music festivals from, say, the 60s and 70s. If you take, for example, the Monterey International Pop Music Festival, which took place in 1967, that those were kind of the first few festivals that were about the counterculture and this coming together and supporting art and community and unity. And that was a message, that was a story that they were delivering, and you could see it in everything and every way that the event was designed. And those fundamentals are still very much ingrained in a lot of our current music events, like Glastonbury. Glastonbury is very big, as well as a lot of our other music festivals, on Leave No Trace. And you can see this Leave No Trace message being delivered through the entire event experience. And so it's woven into the fabric of the audience experience as well as the event design. And so if I were talking to first year undergraduates, I would explain that storytelling doesn't necessarily have to be this long narrative or this long complex history of cultural traditions and things, although they are often are, especially in cultural festivals and events, but they can just be a simple message that then serves to create this kind of storytelling experience that takes place within the event and between audience members at the event. Personally, I find storytelling in reenactment events and heritage festivals very interesting if we're looking at those kinds of events, because they not only have their own story, if you look at the history that they're retelling, but there's stories within the different makeup of the physical features. So if you look at a reenactor's costume, the buttons and the way it fits, all of those reflect a particular era or a time period and a particular member of society. And so there's stories within the stories, depending on how interested you are in those. I'm really interested in them. But it's very complex and very layered. And depending on what kind of events you want to get into, the story dynamics may change and shift because of those nuances. I mean, even the way that people speak, their accents, their vernacular in those kind of reenactment events is important for the story as well. So I guess I would kind of end on that when talking to students, in that storytelling takes place within the whole event experience. It's this ongoing narrative that's delivered through the event space and through people and through their communications, their performances, the material culture, the marketing. It's the overall atmosphere. It's not just information being delivered to people.
That's great.
Hope
Thanks.
that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense. So kind of 2 points I was just thinking. First, this links really well to another podcast by Danny O'Brien, and he was just talking about kind of conveying your strategy and vision and mission for an event and festival, and how trying to kind of be authentic with your leadership, right? And make sure that is very, very clear to the consumer. And in a sense, when you're talking about kind of hammering home that kind of leave no trace, for example, that links quite closely to integrated marketing communications, isn't it? Kind of just making sure that your voice and message is consistent. So there's such overlap between kind of a more social science, arts, humanities concepts of storytelling and like the hardened concepts of, strategy and management and marketing communications. So it's quite interesting to always see these parallels going on. They're trying to do something similar in a nuanced, different way. And my second point was when you were saying about the nuance of things, how important getting the nuance right. A mate was in Jersey Boys in Broadway in the theatre production, and Robert De Niro was directing it, and another one, or maybe another one he was doing, and he was just saying that he pointed, he didn't care about the story narrative, he didn't care about the meta narrative really at all. He cared more about whether he'd done the second button up, because at that time, every gangster had the second button up. And it was just when you said that, I just thought it's that absolute overarching story, but it's also that just fine tuning that gives that believability, doesn't it? With it all, and it just resonated when you said that.
Yeah, there's a lot of which jumping to, I think probably we'll come to later in this podcast. There's a lot of really great literature out there on those kinds of things within reenactments, on dress. There's some really great articles I can give you later if anyone's interested in that kind of dealing with historical accuracy versus authenticity when creating reenactment events and thinking about costuming. Yeah, it's a really interesting area when you're talking about storytelling within reenactment events that you can find yourself going down into rabbit hole literature. And yeah, it's a really great field for study.
It's fun. That's what I love about teaching events. You go from the kind of boring, dry strategy business stuff right through to the design elements to it. And actually, there's something for everyone, I think, in an events degree, actually. Really, really genuinely do. In terms of, where the concept is going in the future, Brianna, like what are the kind of key future trends, would you say, in the concept of storytelling?
Storytelling is so dynamic, and you've already touched on this, that it crosses over these different fields, and other people may think differently. Again, it's an interpretive field, right? So it's subjective, and in my opinion, my observation of it, it's very much ingrained in interpretation practice. So if you think of storytelling, of course, it's an ancient practice. I've already mentioned cave paintings and figurines and generational oral storytelling, things like that. But in terms of events, and even more so in tourism, it is linked to the practice of interpretation, which it comes from natural heritage. That's where it was first established, which was with naturalists. And in order to create a really good story, you should be thinking about the social interactions that play out, what traditions that need to be upheld, the kind of symbolic values for the event, and all of that stuff. But in order to think about how it developed, you should be looking at, especially for events, how we take a story, interpret it, and then decide how to deliver it to an audience. And in the 50s, Freeman Tilden, who was a naturalist, he looked at some of the things that earlier naturalists had looked at, who had said, for example, how do you interpret a rock? How do you make a rock interesting and engaging for people to want to learn more about? And so when you're telling a story, essentially the principles that Freeman Tilden developed was that the interpretation, but for the context of this podcast, the story, it needs to relate to the audience. They need to be able to connect with it in some way. It's not just information. It's more than that. You need to make it engaging. It is an art form, and therefore maybe when you're delivering the story, it needs to include media, different art forms in its delivery. It should not just be telling people information. You should be provoking people to want to learn more, to want to know more, to become interested in it. and it should encompass the entire story, the entire theme. You should be looking at, remember, we were just talking about design. It's kind of like a set design. You want to make the whole experience about the story. And then very importantly, it should be able to be delivered to all ages. So if you have a story that you're delivering to adults, you should be able to deliver it in such a way to children as well. And not by omitting things or removing things. You should be able to work out how to tell everyone this story in an inclusive way. And so in terms of how the concept has developed, if you go back and look at the literature on interpretation, it's very much ingrained in that framing and in that development of how interpretation has developed over time within the tourism and events fields. And how do we take information and deliver it to an audience in an engaging way to make them want to appreciate it and want to know more about it and become invested in it at the end of the day? Because when you're talking about events, you want them to come back. You want them to purchase tickets for the next go around. And you have to create an experience that engages them in that way. And that comes back to the theme and the story that you're telling them.
That's great. Thanks, Brianna. It kind of and for those that are interested in more of this, and perhaps on the more kind of immersive event and storytelling side, there's going to be a podcast that I'm doing later today, actually, with Nick Moran, who runs Phantom Peak in Canary Wharf or close to Canary Wharf. It's a huge, big Wild West town, and he uses storytelling and immersion to kind of get people to keep coming back, like every season upon season. So anyone interested in knowing a little bit more about that, there'll be a lot of insights from there. That's super, Brianna. In what I was going to say as well is it's on my side. I'm really interested in the impact of events and the legacies that they bestow for local people, community regeneration, the stories that are told afterwards. Slightly different take on what you're saying, but aligns in lots of different ways. And one thing, we're seeing a lot of large scale events being cancelled, vetoed, taken out the calendar because they can't demonstrate what they mean to local people. People seeing themselves disrupted and displaced, and it's a shame because events and festivals are powerful things for social change. And it's just a case that where we haven't either got the data or we don't really tell the story very well, or event managers are just on to the next one and then the next one. And they're not very good at necessarily reflecting on the evaluation and everything and telling that story of why they exist in a community or a city or a town or a country or the world or, the planet in some sense. So I'm really interested in how they tell better stories about why they exist as an entity for the people that are affected. So I take it the kind of concepts that you're talking about, Brianna, that it kind of extends in some way to that post event part. Is that true or less so?
Good stories will, yes. So events and festivals aren't there just to entertain. They should be educated in some way, and that will come through the story. Even business events and expos have a story in there. They're thematically designed and things like that. But if we're looking at, for example, heritage festivals and music festivals, reenactment events, things like that, they can contribute to the enhancement and quality of local life, especially for those communities that those events take place in. A lot of those events might promote the small businesses in the local area. Many might promote the local community, and this will help to enhance local pride. For example, I'm co-leading a heritage festival at the Buckingham Old Jail next month, and it's the museum's very first heritage festival. But the jail aspect is only part of it. The festival is about Buckingham and the community and who the community is, and spotlighting people, in the community to help build that sense of cohesion and feeling that Buckingham pride. And so the activities that we've developed and the history talks and everything, it's about the community, more so than the jail. And so storytelling can be very effective, and events can be very effective for enhancing a community's appearance on a regional or even maybe even a national scale. And it can really help to enhance the quality of life for local communities. I would say it's very important, though, to get the community involved in both the event planning, but also the storytelling, because if you're telling their story, then those voices need to be included in how that story is being told and how that narrative is being developed. It's one thing to write a story, it's another to write a story about someone else's history and heritage and such.
That's a great point. This is such a great point. And we could go to town on the critical aspects of that and how that's not done enough, and how events just plonk themselves in destinations and just tell their own story and not those that they're meant to serve. Cool. Okay, that was really, really interesting. Thanks, Brianna. And I'll kind of give you a shout afterwards to just maybe put together with me some resources maybe that could go underneath the podcast, like you mentioned, if anyone's interested in any further reading on this. But thank you so much for coming and taking part in Inside Events. It's been a real pleasure. And hopefully we'll have another follow-up one about maybe something kind of more specific in terms of what you were talking about. So thanks a lot for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.